leads us, I guess, to the piece of the shroud they took that was actually not
So,
made it not
so
accurate.
here's the background. We spent 18 months planning our experiments before we ever went to Turin. During that 18 months, we perfected it. We did a test plan that was like 70 pages long, approximately. The whole test plan's on shroud.com, by the way. So you can see what we submitted to the owner of the shroud, which is not the Catholic Church at that moment in time, or even now for that matter. The owner of the shroud was King Umberto, the deposed king of Italy, the royal family, the Savoy family. And it had been in their family for over 500 years. That's who gave us permission to examine the shroud. The people in Turin are formally known as custodians of the shroud. So when the king announced to them that he had given permission to these guys from big name American laboratories to come and do what they'd never been given permission to do, you can imagine those guys in Turin were not very happy. To this day, some of them are still upset by the fact that we were given that permission. Okay, so I'm not. I think I've lost my train of thought. Wasn't sure where I was going with all this. Radiocarbon dating. Yeah, as far as the sample site goes, we spent 18 months planning 5-minute increments because it's a big piece of cloth and we could have several experiments going at the same time. So we had to chart that out and they broke it into 5-minute increments. When they went to collect the sample for the radiocarbon dating, they stood over the shroud for an hour and a half arguing over where to take that single sample. Initially, they were supposed to take multiple samples from a couple of different areas of the shroud. And any scientist will tell you that if you're taking a key sample from the shroud, then you want to go somewhere else on that cloth, far away from there, and take a control sample so you have a point of comparison. They didn't do that. They took one sample, they cut a strip, they cut the strip in half, put half of it aside as a reserve sample, took the other half, divided it in thirds, and gave it to the 3 labs. What's interesting about that strip is they got one date at one end and a dramatically different date at the other end of the strip. It was anomalous and inconsistent, inhomogeneous. Now, if they got the exact same readings all the way throughout the strip, then we couldn't debate the quality of sample. But because they didn't, and because they had a succession of dates, the only way they reached their 95% was excluding some of the readings they got that would have pushed them below 95%. We learned this from the raw data 27 years later. And in some cases where they couldn't get a proper reading, they averaged a couple together. All of that, bad science. I mean, any scientist I've ever spoken with has said, well, what did they use as a control sample? And I said, they didn't take a control sample. And when scientists who weren't involved in any way hear that, they go, well, that's bad science. I said, yeah, well, it only took 30 years for the world to find that out. And now the press releases will say, well, they radiocarbon dated back in 1988, but we now know that the sample they choose didn't represent the main body of that cloth because it didn't. And here's the irony. They didn't want any involvement from our team members, and yet we were the only science group in the world that had hands-on experience studying the shroud at that moment in history. But this was 10 years after we finished our work, 10 years after we did our work. And so, the frustration that we had was knowing that if you look at the white light photographs I made of the shroud, and you look at that corner where the sample was taken, and you look at that area where the strip was cut from, guess what? It's a different color than the rest of the shroud next to it. So there was already something visibly different about that. And later analysis done by some of our team guys found that the chemical composition in that area was somewhat different than the main body of the shroud. So they never radiocarbon dated the shroud. Some of it might have been from the shroud, but some of it was extraneous and anomalous from either a repair or something, and consequently did not give a realistic, accurate date for anywhere else on that cloth.
So we need to take a sample more closer to the middle, Or just could it be
Well,
anywhere
look,
on the outside?
no, no, not necessarily, but several samples need to be taken, and one needs to sit down. I say one, people need to sit down that are qualified and determine what would be credible places to take it from. Not wait until an hour, you're standing over it and then argue for an hour and a half over to where to take a sample. That's ridiculous, especially if something this important.
If a lot of
You know,
people have handled it, though, wouldn't it,
yeah.
mess it up and you wouldn't get accurate anyway?
Well, that wouldn't necessarily change the radiocarbon date, but it would certainly eliminate the possibility of any credible DNA analysis for sure. Look, I'm a long haired Jewish guy. My DNA's all over that cloth too. And since we're talking about DNA, everybody who's ever handled the shroud, touched the shroud, repaired the shroud, the poor Clare nuns that repaired it in 1534 from the 1532 fire, they handled it all over the place. All of our team members leaned over it, handled it. We didn't find out until 2008 that we're shedding epithelial cells constantly, but we're leaving a trail of our DNA wherever we are. And when you lean over that cloth and breathe on it, you've left your DNA there. Maybe in minute quantities, but you have done so. If you've cried over it, kissed it, as some have done over the century, everybody's DNA's on it. So you'd think that that would be bad enough, right? But no, it gets worse. In 2002, clandestinely, the Turin authorities convinced Pope John Paul II, who was kind of in his last stages of life, that they needed to do this intervention and rescue the shroud. So they went in and removed the patches that had been sewn in to repair the fire damage back in 1534 by the poor Clare sister. The sisters had sewn a backing sheet onto the shroud to add stability to it because there were holes burnt through it. So they removed the backing sheet. The two women from Switzerland who handled it did so without gloves, hairnets, masks, or any protective clothing, and they handled it for 32 days. Wow. And they contaminated every square centimeter of that cloth with their DNA. So if we did a DNA analysis today of the man of the shroud, we find he was a Swiss woman. DNA is never going to be a viable test on the shroud. And everybody said, well, can't you compare it with some of the miracles that the Catholic Church has that are blood related? No, because it's so contaminated that there's nothing really to compare with. And we don't know if those blood related miracles that the church has are credible scientifically.
So
They
what test do you think we should do today, or if we can?
Well, frankly, the best test would be the same kind of non-destructive tests that we did 46 years ago, remembering that the technology that we have today is orders of magnitude better than what we had back in 78. Now, we had the state of the art of technology in 78 with us, best of the best, but it's 46 years later. And some of the tests, for example, the tests that Dr. Adler performed on the blood, we now have tests that would put it to rest forever with scientific certainty that his conclusions were correct. But based on the technology he had, it still leaves the door slightly open that maybe he was wrong. And so it would be nice to repeat those tests. Our spectral instrumentation is so much better. Digital photography is so much better. The image sensors in the cameras today are far more sensitive than the film we used in 1978. The resolution of digital photography has now exceeded and gone beyond the best resolution that photographic film could provide. So we don't have to come up with something too dramatically new, just newest versions of the same kinds of non-destructive technology. And it would be nice to update. And look, our team planned to have a second go round, not only to answer the unanswered questions that remained unanswered, but also to answer some of the 1,000 new questions that when we brought that data back, brought in all these new questions to be answered. But church politics stopped us from ever getting that second opportunity.
So it is owned by the Pope, not the
Yeah,
church as a
not the
whole.
church.
Okay.
Yeah, when King Umberto died in 1983, unlike his predecessors for 5 centuries, he decided not to leave it to his son, who, by the way, just passed away just a month or so ago. And decided he also was wise enough not to leave it to the institution, because then he understood it would take 130 cardinals to vote. And that's not a good situation. So he felt that one person should make these decisions. Certainly, the Pope, who has this Pontifical Scientific Academy as advisors, and external advisors like people like us that have had hands-on experience. But this Pope has decided. So at the time when King Umberto died in 83, it took 2 years to probate his will. And in 85, the legal ownership of the shroud transferred to then Pope John Paul II. Upon his passing, it went to Pope Benedict, and upon his retirement, it went to Pope Francis. And so the Pope is now the one person legally owning the shroud.